Hello everyone, I'm Thibault, and I'm gonna talk about how we at Birdie have been trying to avoid boilerplates and repetitive codes in React Native using a library we built in-house, which is called Galette. So quick word about myself. I am a French engineering student. My studies are in Paris. I'm currently an intern, full-stack engineer at Birdie. I'm passionate about everything about new tech in web, mobile, and more different industries. Okay, so just a quick refresher for those who maybe haven't worked yet with Redux or haven't worked on it in a long time. Let's review very quickly how the Redux pattern works with React. So it has, let's say, 4 or 5 different components. You have, of course, views, which are your React component, which we've all been using, so it's exactly the same for React Native. You have your actions, which are basically a plain object, which will be able to mutate our state, which is like a big object containing the state of your application, which is handled by reducers, which are functions which will mutate the state thanks to the action payload. And then, not shown on this graph, but around here you would have selectors, which would allow your components to select pieces of the state to be able to display them on the screen. We've been facing different problems with Redux over the last 18 months. A lot of those problems were with boilerplate and performance, and just being able to write concise code that we can easily maintain and not spend too much time on the boring things in order to actually move along with our business logic. So I've picked up a few of these issues, and I'm going to present to you what we've done in the first place, and then trying to explain how these are actually issues that everyone can encounter with React and Redux, and React Native, of course. And then I'll explain how Galette can actually enable you guys to face these issues in a more concise, less boilerplate, and more efficient code. So the first issue I'm going to talk about is handling lists. This is a very basic example of what we could do with React Redux with an API. So it could be something like loading a list of items, so just an array from an API. It could be clients, could be users, could be like articles from a shop, for example. And then you want to load that list, to store it in your Redux store and display it on your React components. This does sound pretty simple, but it can get very complicated really quickly. So let's look at a bit of code for that. So that's the most basic reducer you could think of for this kind of use case, which would be get a list of clients and handling when you actually have fetched this list from your API. So this is just the reducer part. I haven't looked at the asynchronous, middleware part. But for your reducer, this could be something like when you actually got your clients, so your action is get clients. You just change your piece of state to be the clients from the payload. So that's a very basic Redux reducer, quite simple. That's what we've all learned on the documentation or tutorials with a switch statement and then case and return and a default at the end. And then on the component side, this is a very simple component that we will use this connect HOC that you guys have probably seen on React Redux, which basically takes the state and then maps onto the props of this component the client's list, so as an array. And then I can display it. So in React Native, I could use this flat list component, which is provided by default by React Native. And I can give it 2 different props, which will be my data, being an array, and then render item, which will be a function which will take care of displaying or rendering one single item. So by here I said my client, which would be just a component displaying a client information. So that's pretty simple. But very quickly you're going to realize that the UX isn't necessarily perfect, and since we're dealing with React Native apps, there's a good chance that the networking is quite bad. So you can have very long loading times, you can have errors while you fetch your items. So you're going to quickly want to handle an additional kind of metadata around your list, which could be loading states and error states. So how would you do that? In your state, and you see this is already getting quite big, I'm pretty sure the guys at the back can't see that. But this reducer basically just gets 2 more booleans, which will be loading true or false if we're actually loading the list from the state, and error if there's been, let's say, a networking error, for example. And you can see how that's already quite big. It's still very simple. It's just a list with 2 booleans, and we're already having such a big reducer that the people at the back can't see it, even though the CV is quite big. And you have just a lot of boilerplate with a switch statement, case, return, the default at the end. It's very long, even though it's a very simple use case. On the component side, how to handle that is pretty simple but very repetitive, because you have to put 2 if statements at the beginning of your render method or your functional component to check if your client list is loading or if you have an error for it, and then display an appropriate component in case of loading state or error state. And finally, if you're not loading and you're not having an error, you can finally display your list. This is still quite simple. However, you're going to need to do that every single time you display a list, every single time you display an item in that list, which is getting quite painful to do. And the React Redux connector doesn't really change a lot. Right, but that's not it. Let's say that the list you want to load from your API is big. Let's say you have a large list of clients, for example. A good use case was actually at Birdie not too long ago, where we have an app for our B2B customers, and they have the ability of seeing the list of all the clients that have been assigned to them. We've realized that some of our clients can have up to 200 clients in their list, so 200 elements to render, which would be quite painful on a performance side to load a list of 200 entities from the API every single time we visit the main page of the application. So to handle that, you're probably going to want to do something like pagination, where your API accepts a parameter as a page, so 1, 2, 3, etc., incrementing, and then your Redux parts can handle this page and increment it to get more data with some kind of infinite scroll on the component side. How to do that, since the reducer is getting really big, I just showed one case for the switch statement, which is when you actually got the client, so the success action, and then you merge so the previous clients that you already had in the state, and then the new clients that you just got from the action, so from the API. By the way, this is very error prone, because let's say that your user is trying to, so has a very bad connection, is trying to use your infinite scroll a lot. You might end up fetching the same page over and over again, and then just concatenating that huge list, so you might have duplicates. It's very error prone, basically. And then you can just increment your page number in your state. Okay. On the component side, how to do that? Actually, on React Native is not too bad, because the flat list is quite a good component shipped by React Native themselves. So you can have the on-enriched and unenriched thresholds properties, which basically allow you to dispatch an action into your Redux state every time you reach the end of the list. But still, a lot of boilerplates. So in the end, this is really painful. It is. We've done that a lot at Birdie. We do that on React Native on the mobile side. We do that with React Web on the web side. And if you have a lot of lists on your app, it can be just, you have to do that over and over again across the entire app. And it can get much worse, because what I show you is just to get a list with pagination and error state and loading state, and then just displaying with a flat list. If you have to do styling, business logic, and things around your list, your components are going to get huge. So we need to find a solution. At Birdie, we needed to find a solution to avoid all that boilerplate, because if we need to change one thing, we had to change it across the entire code base. So yeah, we needed a solution. And this solution is called Galette. So what exactly is Galette? It is an open source package with helpers and with helpers to help you reduce your boilerplate on common patterns with React and Redux. So it helps you to reduce your boilerplate and, of course, errors, because it is tested itself. And in the end, the end goal is to help you save a lot of time on the boring things. So let's take back this exact same example, but use Galette for this. How would our reducer look? So remember that reducer with a switch statement, which was something like 20, maybe 25 lines minimum. This is what it looks like with Galette. So Galette has this feature called a collection, which is basically a list. So it's a wrapper around an array, a basic JavaScript array, but with metadata in there. So it will have pagination, error state, and loading state. Just what I showed you, but already implemented for you. So how does this work? So you still have your client reducer, which is a basic function. You have your initial state, of course, and then you get the action as a second parameter. And what you just do is return something that's an import from Galette, which is called reduce listen items. This function takes 3 arguments. It takes your state and your action, just like a basic reducer, and a configuration object. And this configuration object, everything is documented on the GitHub page, which I will give you the link at the end of the talk. But basically what you do is give a few arguments. So it's going to be the action prefix, which is basically the name of your action, and then it's going to append success and failure to the name of the actions. The list key in state is, so when you do state.clients.list, for example, to get the actual array. So it's just the key in your Redux state. You have the item identifier resolver, which basically takes one item of the list and returns a unique identifier. The most common example would be just an ID, like a unique ID. And in the end, the payload resolver, which is a function that takes the success action and returns the payload, so the array of clients in our case. What's really cool about this is that just with this function, you handle exactly what I showed you just before on the reducer side. On the component side, what you just need to do is use this scrollable collection component and give it your collection, which you get directly from the state with a selector that is shipped with Galette, of course. This render row, which is exactly like the render item prop from the scroll view in React Native, or the scroll list. And on refresh, which is when you pull to refresh your list, and the zero state placeholder message, which is when you don't have any items. That's the basic config, and that handles everything for you. So the little activity indicator, the spinner, when you're fetching new data or the first batch of data, the error states, which with a custom component you can display, all those kind of things. Just the boring things that you're going to do a lot of times in many different projects, all in one place, done for you and tested. OK, so that was our first use case. You can already see how the collections in Galette can really help you with just reducing boilerplates and getting things done much quicker. By the way, in the collection module of Galette, you have a lot more things. If you need more customization around this, we're exporting every single function that we use internally, which means that you can just use just a few functions from there to still help you on more custom reduces. OK, second use case would be displaying an item efficiently. So let's take exactly the same example. So I have my super client list. And when I click on one client, when I press on one client, I want to get to the client page. So I have a couple of things to do for this. I need to load the client from the state, or I need to fetch him or to fetch the profile from the API if it's not loaded yet. For example, if I'm coming from a deep link. And we have some performance issue as well. So to some of this, so you have to store the array of clients in your reducer, and then using some kind of selector like this, so user.find, and then you find the user for this user ID, or the client with the client ID, and that could be settled, right? This is what we did at Birdie for the beginning, but this has a huge performance issue. Let's take back the example of our use case where we had a list of 200 clients. A Redux selector like this one will be run every single time that the component tree has to re-render. So every time something changes and we need to re-render the component tree or any part of the component tree, we're going to need to run this function. Doesn't seem too bad, it's just a find on an array. But doing that many times per second in some cases on a list of 200 items can be very, very memory consuming and can take actually quite a bit of time. And we've had exactly this use case at Birdie, and we've had just the app going extremely slow when clicking one client. And every time we're rendering, the app was just really slow. Second problem with displaying just one item is I need to fetch it from the API and display it. but I also need to ensure that we've already fetched the value from the API, that I actually have the client for this ID I just clicked on. So which means that I have to do repetitive null checks. Basically, if I don't have a client, show something else. If I do have a client, I can finally show the client page. And basically, you just have a lot of boilerplates to fetch the entity. Quick example. So I've got my selector here. So get user by username, which you get a username, and then you do set user.find, which I just showed you with the client's example. Same kind of lists. And then for my class, for my component, on the constructor, I'm getting the props. I need to check that I do have the user in my props. If I don't, I need to dispatch an action to fetch the user. And then in the render method, I also need to check that I do have the user, because if I don't, I need to, for example, return null or some kind of loading indicator. And then finally, I can do something with my user. Here, console log it, but of course, display some kind of page. That's, again, a lot of boilerplates. And here, I don't even have the connect HOC. Right. So what's the Galette solution for this? Much simpler. You see that the component part is literally just the console.log. So it's just the render of the item. Once I'm sure I have fetched the item, that I can really display it. And it's not going to be undefined or null or an empty object whatsoever. The interesting part is what we use instead of the connect HOC that we all know and love from Redux. Same thing, just provide your user screen or the component you want to wrap, and then a config object. This config object would be the property you want to inject your item into. So basically, this is props.user. This comes from here. The load entity action, which is the action you want to dispatch to your state when you don't have the entity yet. So that's just going to be my load user. Then I have my entity selector. So this is just my selector from Redux. And finally, the identifier from props resolver. This is a really cool feature. So let's say that you're using some kind of navigation with a navigation parameter being the username. You can just get the username from this. So the last parameter, it will be directly injected into the selector. So here it gets the username as a parameter, and it will directly inject it into the selector so that you don't need to do any kind of boilerplate with the props. It's all done automatically for you. And that's it. Once this is done, you can just get started with your component. You know that your user will be fetched from the API or from the list directly, and you don't have anything to worry about. OK. And of course, for the performance issue, this is entirely compatible with the collection API I just showed you, which means that since the collection is indexing the items not in an array, but indexing them by ID, you don't have any performance issue because you're just selecting state.users for the username directly. So it's indexed by the username or by the identifier. So this completely solves the performance issue with large lists. Great. Let's talk about a third use case, which is a bit more of a few tricks that we have to implement as well. For smaller things, it's less like a big API like the collection one, but it's still super useful. So I've identified a few different places in a Redux pattern where you would have a lot of boilerplates, and those would be in the reducer. Like I showed you the switch statement, which is already resolved by the collection reducer. But if you need something more complex, you might not have a good use case for the collection part. So you still would want something that would reduce your boilerplate. I'm going to show you that in a minute. You have boilerplates in actions, so the action creators. I will show you that as well. And then handling errors, which is a great piece. So let's start with the first one, which is the boilerplate in the reducers. So again, this is a very simple reducers. You have your switch case break, case break, default return. That's the very simple reducer we all know. But again, that's a lot of boilerplates. So how can we reduce all the boilerplate from this while using Galette? It's with a function called create mapped reducer. This function is super simple. It's like 5 lines of code in our code base. And what it does is takes an initial state and then a map from the action name to the actual sub-reducer you want to use for this action. So basically, if the action is get user, I want to do this. If it's get user success, I want to do this. If it's a failure, I want to do that. And that's it. So you don't need to do your switch case anymore, which is pretty simple if you look at it, but it saves a lot of space. And also, if you're using TypeScript, which is a completely other subject, you can type the action here, and it's just going to allow you to avoid like strongly type your action for every single switch case, which would add a lot of boilerplate again with TypeScript. So for this one, you can just type the action here, and it'll be just fine, which is nice to have if you're using TypeScript. Boilerplate in the actions. So this is a very simple actions file. So again, for loading a user. So you have your const types, which is like a map from a constant to your action name. And then you have your action creator here. So for example, load user, which will take an argument like the username and will return the action object. So the type being imported from the map here, and then the username from the arguments. That's pretty simple, okay? But if you have, let's say, 10 actions in the same file, it gets big and you have kind of a duplicate. So you have load user, then you could have other actions that you would have as a duplicate again. And also, if you're trying to actually trace back, like if you're trying to debug your Redux management, it's much harder to debug when you have two different things, because you have to do like an overall search in your project every single time. We've had this issue over and over again at Birdie again. Cool. So how can we tackle that in a very simple way with Galette? And that's actually pretty simple. So it's just called a typed action creator. And what this does is just put the action name, put the action creator, so as the two arguments of the function, and then your type is actually a property of the action creator. So load user here is not my action creator. I can use it as a function to dispatch an action. But it also has a type property, which is just my string here. Very simple, but it saves a lot of time, of space, and also like in your huge import statements, saves a bit of space. Very useful. And last but not least, how to handle errors. So what's the best way of handling errors in any program? Probably with a try-catch, which no one likes, basically. It's still a lot of boilerplate. You have to try your catch. You have to do something on every single catch. It's very painful. So the way we do that with Galette is you have an error wrapper, which is a component exported by Galette. You just put it at the very top of your component tree. So for example, just between your store provider and your router, for example. And then you can get an action dispatcher in the props of any component. And you can just use these props report error with a new error object. And that's pretty much it. Then you have reported an error. And the way you can handle this error is, of course, through Redux middlewares or state, reducer. So you can just get those errors and handle them. It could be displaying a snack bar with an error message. It could be sending them to some kind of SaaS debugging tool like Sentry, for example. And that's just a one-liner just to report an error. Even cooler, if you're using Redux Saga, which is a middleware for asynchronous operations with Redux, so for example, fetching items from an API, what you can do is just wrap your Saga generator function. You can just wrap it in the handle Saga errors function. And what this will do is just report an error every single time that you have an error which is thrown in your Saga code. So you can just completely remove all the try-catches you have in the code of your Saga, and you're good to go. OK, so that was just 3 quick use cases of just things that we've had a lot of trouble in the past at Birdie, a lot of boilerplates, a lot of errors, performance issues as well, that we've managed to tackle and that we've put into an open source project, so into Galette. OK, but what's next now? Well, Galette is still in a very early stage. It's very usable. We use all of those features in production, or almost all of those. We use them in production. We've been doing that for maybe 2 months. It works great, but we can still do better. So, apart from what I just showed you, there's still a lot more to discover. There's a whole part with specific standards of APIs, There's a part with React Web as well. This was just for React Native. And there are just some other quick things that I haven't showed because I don't really have time to show everything. What we're going to work on from now is more typings if you're using TypeScript to make sure that you can be extremely type safe with all your reducer and Redux patterns. More documentation to make sure you can actually use everything in Galette and you know exactly how it works. And basically, every time we're going to have a problem at Birdie, and we actually manage to tackle it in a cool way, we'll just put it in Galette. So yeah, just our next problems solved, and why not your next problem solved? So if you guys have any other things that you've had trouble in the past using React Native, using Redux, or even just React Web, and that you come up with a cool solution that doesn't have an open source solution for, feel free to open a PR. I'll put the link in a second. Everything is open source, so we are very open to PRs. We really encourage that. And yeah, here's the link to the repo. So it's github.com/camadventures, which is the startup studio we're working with, /Galette. And yeah, feel free to explore the code. Feel free to open the PR. And yeah, thank you.